So we're going to be talking about lament. Lament isn't necessarily sexy. It's not something that you guys might have experienced in terms of Bible studies or sermon series. But
Shout out to Dylan Watson though, who preached on lament.
He did.
Just last year sometime.
Yes, he did.
In the fall, I think.
Yeah, the first sermon in 100 years of memorial.
Yeah, there you go.
Probably. So I want to read a definition of lament by a gentleman called Sung Cha Ra, who has a book called Prophetic Lament, a call to justice in troubled times. And this is came out in 2015, and a link to buy this book will be out in the email this week. But a great book and a great resource to kind of really dive into. So this is how he defines lament. Lament recognizes the struggles of life and cries out for justice against existing injustices. The status quo is not to be celebrated, but instead must be challenged. So there's a few things going on there. So I think there's three kind of responses that lament evokes in this.
Yeah.
So I think a lament can be a response to personal pain or tragedy.
Yeah.
Death in the family, just a crying out of bleakness.
Something synonymous to mourning.
Yes.
But like the active side of mourning.
Yes. So last week we remembered the 19th anniversary of September 11th. And I think a moment like that in American history kind of evokes that sort of idea.
Sure.
Like laying flowers, signing a book, maybe putting a little American flag or a picture on the fences. And I'm sure we can all remember just the thousands and thousands of pictures and flowers that were there.
And the sense of, may this never happen again.
Yes.
That's a lament
Yes.
sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's one aspect of it. Another part of it is communal cry out against injustice. So I think we see this in racial justice today, marches, NFL players, NBA, and these are all people taking out and said something bigger than just my life is happening, and I want to take a stand against that.
Yeah. You mentioned at the beginning the idea that this might be a kind of a downer of a 20 minutes.
Right. Right.
But that's kind of the idea of lament is like in the face of injustice, maybe we need something more somber and less celebratory.
Right.
So like we think of the NFL players kneeling, Colin Kaepernick kneeling for the national anthem. And that's controversial. I understand there are controversial arguments around that. But part of that is the idea of this is a sort of celebratory patriotic act, and I'm bringing it into the realm of the somber.
Yes.
That's kind of something that lament does.
Yes. So my first act of political activism was I was 10 years old, and I was in the UK, and there was, I don't know if this came to the US, but the Make Poverty History movement was out there in kind of like the early 2000s.
Okay.
So people would wear like white bracelets, and Edinburgh hosted a march, and 250,000 people marched on the Scottish Parliament to say that we as a nation want to do what we can to eliminate poverty in the nation.
Okay.
So I remember everyone wore white, and 250,000 people marched on the Parliament, which is just like a really powerful moment.
Yeah.
So I think then to move on, the third one is, and this is specifically for the role of prophets in the Bible, then also for, I think, some individuals today, that a prophet or a person on behalf of God cries out for how far the people are from living like God's people. So I think it's very much that God uses people become his spokesperson, spokeswoman, and to grieve and cry out for how brokenhearted God is for how the people are living at a particular time.
Yeah.
And Drew, could you talk a little bit about where is the Book of Lamentations grounded in the story of the Bible in terms of chronology, and what other parts of Scripture invite us into a space of lament?
Yeah. Well, the reality is we find lament in lots of different places in the Bible, in the story of the Bible. We often find individual characters lamenting. We've talked before about King David's affair with Bathsheba, and then him being confronted by the prophet Nathan. And after Nathan confronts David, David goes into a time of mourning and lament about his own sin. So we see it in kind of individual stories within the Bible as
Even
well.
Jesus on the cross.
Yes.
Quoting the Psalms, my God, why have you forsaken me?
That's right. So Jesus is quoting Psalm 22 from the cross, a psalm of lament. which is two things really for me. One, a reminder that there are a bunch of lament psalms. In fact, the book of Psalms has more lament songs than any other kind of psalm. So we've got Thanksgiving psalms, we've got praise psalms, but lament psalms make up the largest portion of the book of Psalms. And there Jesus is quoting then from Psalm 22, reminding us that there are, but then also validating this kind of communication with God. By quoting a lament psalm, I think Jesus is giving us permission to talk to God in this way, because the psalmist did it, and now Jesus is doing it. So we've got a lot of lament in the book of Psalms. And then the book of Lamentations itself sits just immediately in the aftermath of the destruction of the city of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. So again, just a quick overview of Israelite history. There's the United Kingdom, which is all 12 tribes under Saul, David, and Solomon.
The tribes of Scotland, England, Northern Ireland, and Wales.
And 8 others. Yes, exactly. And then after Solomon, the kingdom gets divided into north and south. The northern kingdom, which is known as Israel, falls to the Assyrians. That happens in about 622. And then the southern kingdom of Judah falls to the Babylonians in 586. So the book of Lamentations is a book of poems, lament poems, that's written in the immediate aftermath of that destruction. So the city is destroyed, the temple is destroyed. So we've got like political destruction that is being lamented. We've also got religious destruction that is being lamented. And then all of the able-bodied men and women, particularly the young men and women of the city of Jerusalem, were taken out of the city and taken to Babylon to be assimilated into Babylonian culture. And so there's a loss of people as well.
And you can't really stress enough what it means for the temple to be destroyed.
Yeah.
It's that God himself has left the building.
Yes.
God has left us, and everything that was promised is finished.
Yes.
Like, there's just not a way of computing the absence and loss of the temple being laid in ruin.
Yeah. And so then what we read in the book of Lamentations are exactly these kinds of themes, which are all themes of lament. They're themes of absence. So the book of Lamentations is specifically saying God has left us. So themes of abandonment run throughout the book of Lamentations. The question why, which growing up, I never was encouraged to ask the question why to God. When in fact what we've got is a whole book of Lamentations, which is essentially asking God, why has this happened to us? Why has the city been destroyed, the temple been destroyed, all these people been either killed or exiled? So the asking of that question why, all of these are kind of themes that play into the genre of lament as we see it in the Bible.
And I think Dylan may have talked about this when he preached on lament, but I would encourage you to pay attention to, if you listen to worship music or Christian music, and just look at the titles on any Google, on Spotify, search Hillsong, Bethel, like whatever group you like.
Yeah.
I would be surprised if any of them had a title that was anything like lament for any of the songs.
Yeah.
And when we say that, so we had, I know the numbers are different with COVID, but 100 people are in church on Sunday, say, and you're going to have 100 drastically different weeks. Some people may have had an awesome week, some people pretty indifferent, some people may have had the worst week of their life, and they're coming to church just looking for something. And the lyrics for the songs come up, and it's God, you're great, God, you're awesome, and just positive, positive, positive. And sure, we believe those things are true.
Yeah.
But it doesn't give a full picture of the human experience.
Yeah.
And the theological police might say, well, it's not about our experience, it's about God and who God is, and God doesn't change.
Right.
And yes, but God is open to us, and He wants us to bring our entire human experience to Him.
Yeah.
Not just the positive stuff.
God invites us to communicate with Him.
Yes.
From our human experience.
Yes.
Which is sometimes
terrible,
praising and joyful, and sometimes terrible and mournful.
And think about this a little bit. I think that in Protestantism, we have such a focus on the resurrection and new life and growth that anything that doesn't fit into that narrative of change and transformation and healing is a story that's yet to be told.
Yeah.
Like we can't tell it in real time.
Yeah.
We have to wait until that's all polished, and then we can share it.
Right.
Like the stories of an addict becoming sober are awesome,
Mm.
but the story of the guy still drinking on the street corner, that's not quite one we want to share yet.
Right.
So, but I think the process and the space God gives is that wherever you are on the journey, if it's day 1 and it just hit the fan and it's terrible, or it's day 100 and you have a story of healing to tell,
Yeah.
praise God, that's awesome.
Yeah.
But the day 1 story is still as important as the day 100
Yeah.
story.
Bring the day 1 story to God. That's the invitation
Yes.
of lament.
Yes. Because it misses the full human experience.
Yeah.
And I think if we want to be a community that engages with the world and with the city, we have to be able to handle painful stories.
Yeah.
And we have to provide space for people where they can feel like they can share what's on their heart.
Yeah.
So one example, in the church I grew up in Edinburgh, one of the pastors there, his wife sadly passed away from cancer. And they asked people to come to the Celebration of Life service, which is what they called it, they didn't call it a funeral. And they asked everybody to wear Hawaiian shirts. And at the time I didn't think anything of it really. I thought, okay, this is like they're taking a stand to say that we are resurrection people.
Right.
And like, yes, I believe that's true, but I do also believe that it robbed people of the space of mourning.
Right.
Because it felt that the tone was being set, that this is how this service is going to feel,
Mm-hmm.
this is how the service is going to be. And for me, there was a disconnect with, yes, this is what we believe, but this isn't what we're feeling right now.
Yeah.
We feel robbed, we feel hurt, we feel sad, and we feel like we can't put on this happy show.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the way Paul puts it is when we mourn, we don't mourn as those who have no hope, which I've seen, I don't have an example exactly like that, but I have seen people take that to mean we don't mourn, we only have hope.
Right.
Which isn't really what Paul's saying. It's a tension there between mourning and hope, and therefore both can be present in a funeral service, in a celebration of life service. We can provide space for both of those things.
And I think it's interesting, and just in the ways we talk about death, is that the British poet Dylan Thomas, in his sort of fight of this life, his rage against the dying of the light. That when it's death, it's over. There's nothing.
Right.
So just fight and make the most of like every last drop of this life. And I'm sure we've all heard platitudes when people die of, well, they're your guardian angel now, they're one of the stars, like they're in heaven. And it both of those are, the first one is removed from the hope of the resurrection.
Yeah.
The second one is removed from any sort of real undergrounding on what eternal life means.
Yeah.
But also it's removed from the pain of death.
Yeah.
And it's not that the resurrection gives us an eternal perspective. It gives us a horizon that we're aiming for.
Yeah.
But it doesn't give us healing from how robbed we feel. And I think even knowing that there's a life eternal and life was meant to be forever, that it makes actually the loss greater. That we're more aware of, this is just so far from how things are meant to be.
Right.
So I think with our sort of our Western hat and with our Protestant hat, we're doubly removed from being able to engage and talk openly about things that are difficult, things that are bad, and things that don't look good on us. So, and I think also and this is true for America, this is true for the church, if there's a part of America or the church's history, and often those two are conflated, that doesn't look good, we don't talk about it.
Sure.
We kind of excuse it as, well, they were just a product of their time, and they did the best they could, and we just kind of don't really want to go there.
And we focus on people who did good things, or
Yes.
churches who did good
Yes.
things.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a hesitation to talk about these things because we feel like God's on trial. That if we show where the church failed or where Christians failed massively in the past, it's like we're having to defend, our silence defends God.
Right.
But I feel that we have to be much more open and say that God weeps for those things, and for order for us to bring healing to those moments, we need to talk about them openly, and we need to weep about them too.
Yeah.
And platitudes just don't cut it justice
Yeah.
at all. Drew, Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet,
Yeah.
for how he engaged with the people of Israel. Can you talk a little bit about what you think Jeremiah has to teach us about lament, and what that might say to us, or what that might look like for the church today?
Yeah. So the prophet Jeremiah, his prophetic ministry spans that story that we were talking about a minute ago of the southern kingdom of Judah, leading up to the time where the Babylonian army besieges Jerusalem and eventually destroys it and destroys the temple. Jeremiah is offering prophetic words in the years, even decades leading up to that destruction. And Jeremiah is pointing to injustices among the people, which we mentioned as part of lament, part of the prophetic office as well. He's pointing to instances of injustice. He's pointing to instances of corruption within the temple practices, the corruption within the leaders, the religious leaders in the city of Jerusalem. He's pointing out all of these things. And he keeps saying to the people of Judah, you must repent or destruction is coming.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a common prophetic trope. Yeah. And Jeremiah leads all the way up to this, and as Jeremiah's prophetic words progress in the book of Jeremiah is where they're collected. As they progress, one of my colleagues in the School of Ministry describes Jeremiah as almost becoming more and more cynical. So in terms of kind of lamenting the ways that God's people were not acting like God's people, as you mentioned earlier, Jeremiah gets to this point where one reading of his prophecies is something like, Judah, you need to repent, but I know you're not going to. You're just on your way to destruction. And that sort of cynicism is also a sort of edge of lament. Not something I'm sitting here saying all lament ought to have that cynicism as part of it, but it's an edge of it. It's kind of pushing at the boundaries of lament. And the prophet Jeremiah even pushes into that space a little bit. And so that sort of idea of weeping over the direction that Jeremiah sees the people of Israel going is the idea that we get him being the weeping prophet. And then Jeremiah gets connected traditionally, in church tradition, to the book of Lamentations. Now, most scholars don't actually think that Jeremiah wrote Lamentations, or at least didn't write the whole thing. If you go in and read all 5 chapters of Lamentations, it's pretty clear that they've got different tones, different uses of vocabulary. So there are probably multiple authors of the book of Lamentations. Maybe Jeremiah is one of them, maybe not. But the book of Lamentations, again, being written in that immediate aftermath of destruction, and Jeremiah getting connected traditionally to that, Jeremiah even maybe being left in Jerusalem while those poems of lament are being collected and written down, that idea is what also gets Jeremiah this adjective of the weeping prophet. The one who was there when the destruction happened, the one who was there when all the young men and women were carried off into exile, ostensibly never to be seen again, kind of thing. They won't return to Jerusalem, and weeping over those facts, those things that were happening, is what gets him connected to that idea.
Great, good. And do you think that, and this is kind of off the cuff here, what do you think it would look like for the church to have that sort of role today? Can you imagine any areas where that sort of ministry of presence, perhaps, like they were there to witness? Like, where do you think some of the places that see today?
Yeah, I think one of the places that we can do this as the church, and I've seen examples of churches trying to create this kind of space. It's opening up a place for people who have experienced trauma of different kinds. That might be trauma in their family. That might be trauma in war. Speaking of people who are in the military who then come back and need a space to kind of talk about that trauma in their family, trauma in war, trauma because of their race, trauma from church. So it's I think it's about creating space for those stories to be told in all of their like rawness. Again, I encourage people to read the Book of Lamentations if you haven't read it in a while, or if you've never read it. It's very raw. I mean, the language and the imagery that's being used there is the kind of stuff that we might think, ooh, I don't know if I'd say that to God. But opening up space for people to voice their trauma and be able to say that in a sacred space and not be thrown out, not be chastised for you shouldn't speak that way about God, or you shouldn't air those stories in the open. That's one way I think that we could kind of mirror this type of lament.
And I had a professor in undergrad that if you have like a spouse or a sibling or just somebody who you're really close to, and you ask them how they're doing, and they give you an answer, and you know that the words that have come out their mouth aren't matching what they're experiencing,
Right.
and you know as soon as they start talking, you're not feeling this way. Like, can you just give me the decency to be honest and tell me how you're feeling?
Yeah,
But man, look, how often do we talk to God like that?
sure.
And God knows so much more clearly and so much more in depth, even with our closest relationships. And we can tell straight away when like the feelings in the persona doesn't match the words that are coming out.
Yeah,
And just the importance that God knows and God can handle it.
yeah,
Like, it's not our job to protect God from ourselves.
yeah,
God is there for that. And I think that's part of the process of growing in deeper relationship with God, is that we don't feel we need to sanitize what we present to Him. We can just say that this is where I am right now,
yeah,
or this is something I'm angry at right now.
sure.
It doesn't just have to always be personal.
That's good. So Jordan, our contemporary example for this week is Daniel Berrigan,
Yes.
who is a Catholic priest.
Yeah, Jesuit priest. Yeah.
Yeah, and you've done a lot of reading of Berrigan's work, so tell us a little bit why you think he might be a contemporary example of this kind of aspect of prophet.
Yeah, and I think he definitely falls into somebody who would be a prophet in terms of crying out against injustice
Okay.
in the land. And Daniel Berrigan, he was a Jesuit priest. He died in 2016 at the age of 94, and he was last arrested protesting when he was 92. So he was out there, he was on the picket line, the front lines all the time. And he came to prominence in the kind of right in the middle of the Vietnam War, when the Vietnam War and the civil rights movements were two wildfires burning at the same time in the US. And he and a group of 9 priests, who all got arrested, who are known as the Maryland Nine. You can Google this, in 1968. So they got in line to sign up to join the draft.
Right.
And when they got to the clerk's desk to sign the papers, they kept on walking, went into sort of the administrative room, and they all 9 priests walked out with both arms filled with baskets with draft papers. So people that were going to get put into the draft. They poured the papers into a pile in the parking lot, and they had previously broken into a warehouse and stolen napalm, and they poured napalm on the draft papers and set them on fire. And you think of sort of the symbolism of using napalm to burn draft papers.
Yeah.
So napalm is dropped in Vietnam that kills men, women, and children indiscriminately.
Yeah.
The US government is sending our own children, young boys and men, to die for, as you said, the John Kerry quote was, the biggest nothing in history.
Right.
And it was that kind of symbolism of he wanted to do a symbol and take a stand for what he thought was just an egregious thing that his country was doing. And I think also that, I know this treads a line, but our inability to admit defeat and admit when we're wrong, how this kind of plays out on the war front especially. That Vietnam was one of the most costly wars the US ever got into, and you ask any historian, they give you 10 different answers for why we were there, what did it accomplish, who won, and it was just this prolonged thing where thousands and thousands of young men died, and he took a stand and said, this is ridiculous, like what are we doing? Why are we killing children there with napalm, and why are we killing our own children? What point does it serve? And he won awards as a playwright, he won awards as a poet, and I'll attach some of those in the email this week as well, because some really powerful work that he engages with there. And I think he saw his role as a priest he was someone that would administer communion to the people on Sundays, but felt that he had to be a voice that took a stand for the injustices in the world. And particularly with poverty in the US was here, he really kind of said that this is the richest country the world has ever seen, but it is also the most unequal country the world has ever seen. Is that, and this is still true today, and we see it more acutely in coronavirus times, is that our Jeff Bezoses of the world have added a few extra billion to their net worths, and the people who are one paycheck away from being homeless are now, millions of people are one paycheck away from not being able to make the next rent payment, not being able to put food on the table. And in the terms of the Good Samaritan work the church does, is that I've been getting more emails, the church office is getting more emails of people just looking for money for food, or money for a motel for a couple of nights.
Yeah.
And it's that the gap has just gotten wider, but the resources have gotten bigger. And this is true in the time of Israel. It says that in the time just before the Babylon exile, some of the prophets said that silver were like stones in the street.
Right.
It wasn't a time of economic despair. It was boom time. It was the swinging 20s.
Yeah.
But it was the people had gotten so far away from God. And this is a quote. It's a slightly longer quote from Berrigan. He wrote this in the early 70s. And it's in terms of, this was just as the Vietnam War was coming to its end. He said, "The trouble is not that we do not want peace. We have seen enough war. We are sick of it unto death. The war has come home like a stalking corpse, tailing its blood, its tears, its losses, its despairs, seeking like an American ghost the soul of America. We want the peace, but most of us do not want to pay the price of peace. We still dream of peace that has no cost attached. We want peace, but we live content with poverty and injustice and racism, with the murder of prisoners and students, the despair of the poor to whom justice is endlessly denied. We long for peace, but we wish also to keep undisturbed a social fabric of privilege and power that controls the economic misery of 2/3 of the world's people."
It's a powerful quote.
It is. And I think it speaks to that, and this is true for the church, is true for the States, is that we're very quick to want to solve problems elsewhere in the world.
Yeah.
And this is for mission, whatever.
Sure.
But the problems we want to face in our own country, in our own lives, we're far more reticent to engage with.
Yeah.
And I think that before we fix things, we have to really understand what they are. And I don't think that we can engage with that without first mourning what we've lost.
Yeah. Soong Chan Ra, the author of that prophetic lament book, says that we need to treat injustices when we see them. We need to treat them a little bit more like funeral services than like hospital rooms.
Yes.
So we treat a hospital room like it has some hope still, like this person might recover. But at a funeral service, we see the dead body. We recognize that there's a dead body.
Right.
And Soong Chan Ra is saying we need to look at the dead bodies. We need to see them. We need to see the things that have led to them being dead in front of us, and not look away from that. And that's kind of a first step of lament. Yeah. It's good. Thanks, Jordan.
Yeah, thank you, Drew.
I learned a little bit about Daniel Berrigan. Have to go read some more of him.
He is a fascinating character, and I would encourage you guys to do a little Google search there. Yeah.
It's good.
Great. Well, thank you for tuning in. We look forward to being with you next week, where we're going to look at the prophetic lament and what it means to hold institutional power in the church and politics and the nation, what it means for us to hold their power accountable. So thank you for tuning in. I hope you have a good weekend, and we look forward to seeing you virtually next week or in person on Sunday if you're choosing to join us.